The strange thing about war is that sometimes the moment that changes everything looks nothing like a battle. The air inside the temporary medical station still carried the faint metallic scent of overheated circuitry and sterilizing mist as Sergeant Daniel Carter stepped through the sliding hatch, his boots thudding softly against the alloy floor. Outside, the desert wind moved over miles of rust-colored sand and broken stone, rattling the thin antenna towers that ringed the outpost. But inside the chamber, everything felt strangely quiet, almost suspended in time. Rows of pale blue diagnostic lights glowed along the walls, reflecting across unfamiliar alien instruments that hummed with a low, steady rhythm. Daniel had seen enough field hospitals in his 10 years with the Marines to recognize the same universal pattern anywhere in the galaxy. People working fast, speaking softly, and pretending the universe wasn't falling apart outside the doors. What he hadn't expected was the patient lying on the center medical platform. She was taller than most humans, her skin a luminous shade of deep blue that seemed to catch the light like polished glass, and her silver hair spilled across the pillow in slow drifting strands, as if gravity barely touched it. A fractured section of armor rested beside the bed, its curved plates etched with symbols Daniel didn't recognize but could guess the meaning of. Royal markings. Important markings. The alien nurse standing nearby adjusted a hovering scanner with careful hands, her narrow eyes flicking toward Daniel the moment he entered. "Human soldier," she said quietly, her voice filtered through a small translation band around her throat. "You were assigned to security, not medical duties." Daniel shrugged out of habit and stepped closer anyway, the dim readout from the monitor reflecting across his visor. "Yeah," he replied calmly, "but I also know what untreated shock looks like." The nurse hesitated, clearly unsure whether to argue, while the scanner displayed a series of pulsing violet symbols across its screen. Daniel leaned closer to examine the wound near the princess's side, not touching yet, just observing the slow rhythm of her breathing and the faint shimmer of alien bandaging that had already been applied. Even unconscious, she carried a strange kind of presence, like the calm center of a storm. Outside the walls of the station, two civilizations were still locked in a conflict neither side fully understood, but herein this small room, there was only a wounded patient and a soldier trying to keep her alive. Daniel removed one glove and carefully adjusted the stabilizing wrap around the injury, moving slowly, deliberately, the way he'd learned during emergency training back on Earth. The nurse watched his hands with open confusion. After a moment, she murmured something under her breath before the translator caught up with her words. "Too careful for a soldier." Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he finished securing the bandage and checked the monitor again, making sure the pulse indicator remained steady. Only then did he glance up. "Maybe," he said quietly, "or maybe soldiers just see enough damage to know when to prevent more." The nurse studied him like he was some unusual specimen she hadn't expected to find on this world. Across the room, the medical lights flickered softly, reflecting off the alien princess's still face, as if the entire station were holding its breath, waiting for the moment when she would finally open her eyes. For several long seconds, nothing changed except the steady hum of the medical equipment and the distant whisper of wind brushing against the outer walls of the station. Sergeant Daniel Carter remained beside the platform, watching the monitor with the quiet patience of someone who had spent too many nights in places exactly like this. The princess lay motionless beneath the soft glow of the diagnostic lights, her blue skin reflecting faint silver patterns across the ceiling as the scanner slowly completed another pass. The alien nurse adjusted a floating display and studied the readings again with careful concentration. Finally, she exhaled in a slow breath. "Her condition is stabilizing," she said, almost as if the result surprised her. Daniel nodded once. "Good." He slipped his glove back on and stepped half a pace away from the platform, giving the medical staff room to work, though the nurse noticed he did not actually leave the bedside. Instead, he leaned lightly against the edge of a console, arms folded, eyes scanning the room the same way a Marine always scanned unfamiliar territory. The nurse observed him quietly for a moment before speaking again. "Most soldiers in your position would not remain here," she said. "Your war is outside these walls." Daniel gave a small shrug. "Right now my orders say guard the patient." The nurse tilted her head slightly, studying him with a look that carried equal parts curiosity and confusion. The patient you guard is not merely injured, she explained carefully. She is Princess Lyra Vale, heir to the Solarian throne. Daniel did not react the way she expected. He simply glanced at the princess again, then back at the medical readout. Figured she was important, he said calmly. Armor gave it away. The nurse blinked slowly. You show no fear. Daniel almost smiled at that. I am a Marine, he answered. Fear usually shows up later. Another quiet moment passed. Outside, the wind shifted direction and the antenna towers let out a low metallic rattle that echoed faintly through the station structure. The nurse returned to the bedside and carefully repositioned the scanner above the princess's chest. As the soft beam passed across her body, a series of delicate, glowing lines appeared briefly along her skin like distant constellations. Daniel watched the pattern form and fade. Those are healing markers, the nurse explained. Her physiology repairs tissue more quickly than most species. But the process requires stability. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Then we keep the room calm. As if the universe had been listening, the princess's fingers moved slightly against the medical sheet. It was a small motion, barely noticeable, but both of them saw it. The nurse froze. The monitor emitted a gentle chime as the princess's pulse shifted to a stronger rhythm. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Princess Lyra Vale opened her eyes. The color was striking, a luminous violet that seemed to gather the room's light into a single steady gaze. For a moment she looked disoriented, her eyes moving across the unfamiliar ceiling and the glowing instruments around her. Then her focus settled on the figure standing beside the bed. A human soldier in dark armor. Daniel did not step back. He simply raised one hand slowly in a calm, reassuring gesture the same way he might greet someone waking from a long sleep. The princess studied him carefully before speaking, her voice soft but steady as the translator band on the nurse's collar activated. You are not Solarian, she said. Daniel shook his head once. No, ma'am. Her eyes narrowed slightly with curiosity rather than fear. Then tell me, human soldier, she continued quietly, why are you the one standing beside my bed instead of one of my own guards? Daniel thought about the question for a moment before answering. Because right now, he said simply, you needed someone who would stay. Princess Lyra Vale continued to watch the human soldier as if she were trying to solve a puzzle that did not belong in the universe she understood. The soft glow of the medical station lights reflected in her violet eyes, while the quiet rhythm of the monitoring devices filled the silence between them. Sergeant Daniel Carter did not rush to fill that silence. Years of service had taught him that the first moments after someone regained consciousness were fragile, especially in a place far from home. He rested one hand lightly on the edge of the console beside the bed, his posture calm and steady, the way a Marine learned to stand when the situation demanded patience instead of action. The alien nurse adjusted a hovering display and stepped slightly closer to the princess, relief visible in the subtle movement of her shoulders. Your Highness, she said carefully, you are safe for now. Your injuries are stable and the treatment protocols are working. Lyra's gaze did not leave Daniel. The human treated me, she said quietly. The nurse hesitated for a brief moment before nodding. Yes, Sergeant Carter assisted when your condition required immediate attention. Lyra seemed to consider that information with thoughtful silence. Outside the thin walls of the outpost, the desert wind continued its slow, endless movement across the alien world, carrying grains of red sand that occasionally brushed against the structure like distant rain. Inside the room, the air remained cool and still, maintained by the station's environmental systems. Finally, the princess spoke again. You are aware that my people and yours are currently enemies. Daniel nodded once. That has been mentioned. There was no tension in his voice, only a quiet honesty that seemed to surprise her again. Lyra shifted slightly against the support frame of the medical platform, wincing only briefly before the stabilizers adjusted to support her movement. The nurse reached forward instinctively, but the princess lifted one hand slightly, signaling that she was fine. Her attention returned to Daniel. And yet you chose to help me, she said. Daniel glanced briefly at the monitor beside her bed where the pulse indicator continued its steady rhythm. You were injured, he replied simply. That part seemed more important. The nurse gave a faint sound that might have been a quiet laugh of disbelief. Lyra studied him for another long moment before something subtle changed in her expression. The sharp caution that had been present when she first woke seemed to soften slightly, replaced by curiosity. "Sergeant Carter," she said slowly, testing the sound of his name as if committing it to memory. "Tell me something honestly." Daniel tilted his head a little. "I can try." "If the situation were reversed," she asked, "and I had been the one standing over a wounded human soldier, would your people expect me to show the same mercy you showed me?" Daniel thought about that question longer than she expected. The soft hum of the medical equipment filled the quiet space while the wind brushed gently against the station outside. Finally he answered. "I would hope so," he said. Lyra looked at him carefully, as if measuring the truth of that answer. Before she could respond, the nurse's scanner emitted a soft chime and a series of new readings appeared on the display. The nurse leaned closer, studying the information with sudden focus. "Your Highness," she said slowly, "your recovery markers are accelerating faster than projected." Lyra blinked once in surprise. Daniel looked at the screen as well, though the alien symbols meant little to him. "Is that good news?" he asked. The nurse hesitated. "Yes," she said finally, "but it usually only occurs when the patient feels completely secure in their surroundings." Lyra's gaze returned to the human soldier standing beside her bed, and for the first time since she had awakened, a faint hint of a smile touched the corner of her lips. The faint smile on Princess Lyra Vale's lips lingered only for a moment before it faded into something more thoughtful, as if she had just discovered a possibility that had never existed in her world before. The nurse quietly continued adjusting the medical scanner, though her eyes moved back and forth between the readings and the unusual calm between the alien princess and the human soldier standing beside the platform. Sergeant Daniel Carter remained where he was, one hand resting lightly against the console while the pale blue glow of the monitor reflected across the dark surface of his armor. The medical equipment hummed softly, maintaining the steady environment that allowed the princess's body to heal. Outside the station, the desert wind rolled across miles of empty, red sand, occasionally brushing the outer walls with a gentle whisper that sounded almost like distant ocean waves. Lyra slowly shifted her gaze from the scanner to the human soldier again, studying him with quiet curiosity that no longer carried the sharp suspicion she had felt when she first opened her eyes. "Sergeant Carter," she said softly, the translator carrying her voice through the room with a calm melodic tone. "How long have you been stationed on this world?" Daniel glanced briefly toward the sealed doorway before answering. "About 4 months," he replied. "Long enough to know the sand gets into everything." The nurse made a small sound of amusement while checking another diagnostic line. Lyra seemed to consider his answer carefully before asking another question. "And during those 4 months, have you met many of my people?" Daniel shook his head once. "Not face to face." He paused slightly before adding, "Mostly through long-distance communication and a lot of misunderstandings." Lyra's eyes softened slightly at that description. "Yes," she murmured quietly, almost to herself. "Misunderstandings appear to be the most common language between our civilizations." For a few seconds the room returned to quiet again, filled only by the soft pulse of the monitoring devices and the distant wind outside the station. The nurse completed another scan and stepped back, clearly satisfied with the results appearing on the floating display. "Your Highness," she said gently, "the recovery indicators are continuing to improve. Your system is responding well to the stabilization treatment." Lyra nodded faintly, but her attention was still focused on the human soldier. "You remained here the entire time while I was unconscious," she said. Daniel gave a small shrug. Someone needed to make sure the room stayed calm. Lyra's expression shifted slightly, a mixture of curiosity and something deeper that the nurse could not quite name. "Among my people," she explained slowly, "soldiers are trained to protect territory, resources, and leadership. Compassion is not considered a battlefield skill." Daniel tilted his head thoughtfully. "Maybe it should be," he said. The nurse paused at that, clearly surprised by the simplicity of the statement. Lyra studied him again for a long moment before a faint glow appeared along the delicate lines of her skin, the natural healing patterns responding to her steady breathing. "Your species is unusual," she said quietly. "You fight wars, yet you speak as if peace is still possible." Daniel looked toward the softly glowing desert horizon through the small observation window near the ceiling. "Most Marines I know would prefer peace," he said. "We just do not always get to choose the timing." Lyra followed his gaze toward the window, watching the dim red light of the alien sunset spread slowly across the sky. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the nurse's scanner chimed again, this time with a tone that carried a hint of urgency. The nurse looked down at the display, and her eyes widened slightly as new signals appeared across the screen. She turned toward the observation window instinctively. Far beyond the desert horizon, tiny points of silver light had appeared in the sky, moving slowly but unmistakably toward the station. The nurse continued staring at the observation window as the silver lights slowly multiplied across the darkening sky, each one moving with quiet precision like distant stars that had suddenly decided to change their position. The medical scanner beside the bed emitted another soft chime as new signals appeared across its display. Sergeant Daniel Carter stepped away from the console and walked toward the narrow window, the alloy floor giving a muted echo beneath his boots. Outside the station, the red desert stretched for miles under a deep violet sky, and above that sky the lights were growing brighter by the second. Daniel narrowed his eyes slightly. Even without military sensors, he could recognize the pattern of controlled formation. Ships. Many of them. Behind him, the nurse adjusted the scanner again, her voice suddenly carrying a note of restrained urgency. Those signals are not local atmospheric craft, she said. They're descending from orbit. Daniel folded his arms loosely as he studied the distant formation. Yeah, he said quietly. I was thinking the same thing. The lights in the sky continued to spread across the horizon like a slow-moving constellation, their motion calm and deliberate rather than aggressive. Inside the medical room, the soft blue lighting reflected off Princess Lyra Vale's skin as she followed Daniel's gaze toward the window. She remained propped carefully against the support frame of the medical platform, her breathing steady as the healing markers continued to glow faintly along her side. For several seconds, she watched the approaching lights without speaking. Then she exhaled softly, almost like someone recognizing the sound of familiar footsteps after a long journey. They found me, she said quietly. Daniel glanced back toward her. Your people. Lyra nodded once. Royal escort vessels, she explained calmly. They were likely searching the entire sector after my transport went missing. The nurse looked between the princess and the sky with visible relief. Your Highness, this means your fleet has located you. They will secure the station within minutes. Daniel looked back toward the horizon where the distant lights were now clearly separating into individual ships descending through the upper atmosphere. The outpost radar system somewhere deeper in the station began to hum faintly as it detected the approaching craft. That might make things interesting, he said. Lyra turned her attention to him again. Why interesting? Daniel gave a small, thoughtful shrug. Because the last time our command logs checked, your fleet and ours were not exactly exchanging friendly greetings. The nurse's expression tightened slightly at that observation. Lyra, however, seemed less concerned. Her violet eyes studied the human soldier with the same thoughtful curiosity she had shown since waking. Sergeant Carter, she said slowly, do you believe your commanders would prevent you from assisting someone who needed help simply because that person belonged to another world? Daniel considered the question for a moment before answering. Most Marines I know would help first and deal with the paperwork later. A faint trace of amusement returned to Lyra's expression. Outside the window, the descending ships were now close enough that their silver hulls caught the fading sunlight of the alien evening. Their movement was smooth and silent, like drifting pieces of polished metal sliding through the sky. The nurse stepped closer to the window and watched them with wide eyes. They are arriving faster than expected, she said. Lyra followed the ships with calm focus before turning her gaze back to Daniel one more time. Sergeant Carter, she said quietly, when my people enter this station, they will expect to find enemies. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. And what will they actually find? Lyra's faint smile returned as the first distant engines began to hum through the desert air. They will find the human who saved their princess. The first vibration reached the station several seconds before the ships themselves became fully visible, a deep, distant hum rolling across the desert like thunder that never quite turned into a storm. Sergeant Daniel. Carter stood near the observation window with his arms folded, watching the silver shapes descend through the violet sky with deliberate precision. Each vessel moved in perfect formation, their hulls reflecting the last glow of the alien sunset, as if the sky itself had fractured into polished metal fragments. The outpost radar system somewhere in the deeper corridors began emitting a steady sequence of alert tones, reacting to the sudden arrival of multiple unknown craft within a few miles of the facility. Daniel glanced briefly toward the sealed doorway before looking back outside. "Well," he said quietly, "that is definitely a royal entrance." Behind him, the nurse adjusted the floating scanner once more, though her attention had clearly shifted toward the sky as well. "Those ships belong to the Solarian Royal Guard," she said with quiet certainty. "They will secure the perimeter before any ground team approaches." Princess Lyra Vale listened calmly while resting against the support frame of the medical platform, her violet eyes reflecting the shifting light from the window as the ships continued their descent. The faint healing patterns along her blue skin glowed softly with each steady breath. She did not appear alarmed by the approaching fleet. If anything, her expression carried a quiet confidence that had been absent when she first regained consciousness. "They are cautious," she explained. "My escort commanders will assume the worst until they confirm the situation." Daniel nodded slowly as he studied the sky. Several of the ships were now hovering far above the desert floor, their engines producing a low controlled resonance that rippled through the thin evening air. Others were circling in wide arcs across the horizon, clearly mapping the terrain around the outpost. "Sounds like good training," he said. The nurse turned slightly toward the princess. "Your Highness, once they confirm your location, they will send a recovery team immediately." Lyra's gaze moved briefly toward the medical monitors beside her bed before returning to the window. "Yes," she said softly. "They will come quickly." Daniel pushed away from the console and walked a few steps closer to the window, studying the movements of the fleet with a professional eye. After years of service, he had learned to read the subtle language of ships and formations. These vessels were not preparing for combat. Their spacing was too precise, their movements too measured. They were guarding something valuable, or someone. Behind him, the nurse finished adjusting the scanner and folded her hands together, visibly relieved that the princess's recovery was progressing smoothly. "Your Highness," she said gently, "your people will be grateful that you survived." Lyra looked toward Daniel again, her expression thoughtful. "Yes," she said quietly, "but they will also want to understand how." Daniel gave a small half-smile. "Let me guess. Your official report will probably involve something impressive like elite alien medicine." Lyra tilted her head slightly, the faint silver strands of her hair drifting with the motion. "That would be the easier explanation," she admitted. Outside the window, one of the larger ships slowly descended closer to the surface, its hull now clearly visible against the darkening sky. A narrow beam of scanning light extended from its underside, sweeping gently across the desert until it passed directly over the medical outpost. The station sensors responded instantly with another alert tone. Daniel watched the scanning beam move across the sand before it settled briefly on the station roof. "Looks like they found us," he said. The nurse looked toward the princess with anticipation. Lyra's gaze remained steady on the human soldier. "Sergeant Carter," she said calmly. "When they arrive, they will ask me what happened here." Daniel nodded once. "Fair question." The princess held his gaze for a long moment before answering softly. "And I intend to tell them the truth." The scanning beam from the descending ship lingered over the medical outpost for several long seconds before slowly fading, as if the fleet above had finished confirming what they already suspected. The sky beyond the narrow observation window was now filled with the quiet movement of silver vessels holding their positions high above the desert. Their engines produced a low, steady vibration that traveled through the station walls like distant thunder rolling across open land. Sergeant Daniel Carter stood with his hands resting loosely on the edge of the window frame, watching the fleet with the calm focus of someone who had spent years learning how quickly situations could change. Behind him, the medical room remained filled with the gentle glow of blue lights and softly humming instruments. Princess Lyra Vale shifted slightly against the support platform, her strength returning little by little as the healing markers along her side continued their slow, steady pattern. The nurse checked the floating display one more time before glancing toward the window again. "Your Highness," she said carefully, "the royal ships have completed their scans. A landing team will arrive shortly." Lyra nodded once, though her attention had already returned to the human soldier standing beside the observation window. "Sergeant Carter," she said softly. "In a few minutes this room will be filled with my people." Daniel looked back over his shoulder and offered a small shrug. "I figured that part was coming." Lyra's violet eyes studied him closely, as though measuring the quiet confidence in his voice. "They will be cautious," she continued. "My escort commanders are trained to assume danger until they are certain none exists." Daniel turned slightly, leaning one shoulder against the wall beside the window. "That sounds a lot like how Marines operate too." The nurse allowed herself a small smile at that comparison before returning her attention to the monitors. Outside the window, the largest ship slowly descended lower through the evening sky, its polished hull reflecting the red sand below like a mirror. A second beam of light extended from the vessel, sweeping across the desert terrain before stopping directly above the station entrance. The ground beneath the beam shimmered faintly as the landing guidance system began preparing a safe approach corridor. Daniel watched the process quietly. "Looks like your ride is about to park," he said. Lyra followed the movement of the descending ship with calm focus. The faint glow along her skin had become steadier now, a sign that her body was recovering faster than expected. For a moment she remained silent. Then she spoke again in a quieter tone meant only for him. "When my guards enter this station, they will expect to see an enemy soldier standing beside their princess." Daniel tilted his head slightly. Hard to argue with the uniform. Lyra's expression softened with a trace of humor. "Yes," she said gently, "but I will make certain they understand something important." Daniel crossed his arms again and glanced toward the doorway that led to the outer corridor of the station. "And what exactly will they understand?" Lyra held his gaze with quiet certainty. "They will understand that the human soldier who stood beside me was never my enemy." At that exact moment, a distant mechanical tone echoed faintly through the station as the outer landing pad systems activated. The nurse looked up from the scanner immediately. "Your Highness," she said, "the first shuttle has just touched down." Daniel exhaled slowly and looked back toward the window one last time before turning toward the door. "Guest introductions are about to begin." The soft mechanical tone announcing the shuttle's arrival faded into a steady background hum as the station's landing systems completed their sequence. Sergeant Daniel Carter stood near the doorway to the corridor now, listening to the distant sounds of movement echoing faintly through the structure of the outpost. Outside, the royal vessels remained suspended across the sky like silent guardians watching the desert below. Inside the medical chamber, the calm glow of the diagnostic lights reflected across the instruments and walls, creating a quiet contrast to the arrival unfolding just beyond the station doors. Princess Lyra Vale remained seated against the support frame of the medical platform, her posture stronger than it had been when she first opened her eyes. The faint healing patterns along her blue skin had dimmed slightly, a sign that her body had moved past the most critical phase of recovery. The nurse studied the monitors for another moment before gently powering down one of the scanners. "Your Highness," she said softly, "the stabilization cycle is complete. You are strong enough to speak with your escort commanders when they arrive." Lyra inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, though her attention drifted toward the doorway where Daniel now stood. For a moment she watched the human soldier in silence, the quiet rhythm of the room filling the space between them. Then she spoke. "Sergeant Carter." Daniel glanced back over his shoulder. "Yes, ma'am." Her violet eyes held his with a thoughtful calm. "You are preparing to leave the room." Daniel gave a small shrug. "Seems like the polite thing to do when a royal guard team walks in." The nurse looked between them with mild curiosity, though she said nothing. Lyra studied him for another second before shaking her head slightly. "No," she said gently. "You will remain." Daniel blinked once, surprised by the certainty in her tone. "Pretty sure your guards might have opinions about that." Lyra allowed the faintest smile to return. "They may," she admitted, "but I am still their princess." The distant corridor outside the room suddenly carried the sound of approaching footsteps and quiet voices speaking in a language the translator band struggled briefly to interpret. The nurse straightened instinctively as the sounds grew closer. Daniel turned toward the doorway fully now, his posture relaxed but attentive. A moment later the sealed door at the end of the corridor slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. Several tall figures appeared beyond the threshold, their silver armor catching the blue glow of the medical lights as they stepped cautiously into the station hallway. The leader of the group paused just inside the entrance, scanning the room with disciplined focus before his gaze settled on the medical platform where the princess sat upright. For a brief moment the entire room fell silent. Then the armored figure lowered his head respectfully. "Your Highness," he said, relief clearly present in his voice. "We located your signal and came as quickly as possible." Lyra inclined her head in return. "Commander Varys," she replied calmly. "Your timing is excellent." The commander stepped forward another pace before noticing the human soldier standing quietly near the wall beside the observation window. His posture shifted slightly, not hostile but unmistakably alert. "Your Highness," he said carefully, "there is a human marine present." Lyra turned her gaze toward Daniel and then back to her commander. "Yes," she said simply. "There is." The commander waited for further explanation. Lyra's expression remained calm and steady as she spoke her next words. "And you will treat him with the same respect you would offer anyone who protected your princess." Commander Varys remained still for a moment after hearing the princess's words, the polished surface of his silver armor reflecting the calm blue light of the medical chamber. The other members of the royal guard stood just behind him in a disciplined formation, their attention shifting briefly toward the human marine near the wall before returning to their commander for direction. Sergeant Daniel Carter did not move from where he stood. His posture remained relaxed, one shoulder leaning lightly against the wall beside the observation window, as if the presence of an alien royal guard unit inside a remote outpost was simply another unusual detail in a long career full of strange assignments. Princess Lyra Vale watched the silent exchange between the two sides with quiet composure. Her violet eyes moved from Commander Varys to Daniel and then back again. The nurse beside the medical console seemed to hold her breath, aware that this moment would define how the encounter unfolded. Finally, Commander Varys lowered his head slightly toward the princess in acknowledgement of her command. "Your word is law, Your Highness," he said with calm respect. He then turned his attention fully toward the human marine. For a brief second the room remained silent as the two soldiers from different worlds studied each other across the softly lit chamber. Daniel gave a small nod of greeting. "Commander," he said simply. Varys returned the gesture with equal formality. "Sergeant Carter." The nurse released a quiet breath of relief and returned to monitoring the medical displays while the tension in the room eased. Outside the observation window, the royal fleet still hovered across the sky, like a silent constellation watching over the desert below. Commander Varys stepped closer to the medical platform, his posture respectful but clearly concerned for the princess's condition. "Your Highness," he said carefully, "our entire escort fleet has been searching the system since your transport signal vanished 3 days ago. We feared the worst." Lyra inclined her head slightly. "Your persistence was not wasted, Commander." Varys glanced briefly toward Daniel again before returning his attention to the princess. "Our scans detected unusual damage near your transport's last location," he explained. "We assumed the craft was lost during atmospheric descent." Lyra's gaze shifted toward the human soldier standing near the wall. "The situation was more complicated than that," she said calmly. Varys followed her line of sight once more. "Then perhaps the human marine can clarify." Daniel pushed himself away from the wall and walked a few steps closer to the center of the room, though he maintained a respectful distance from the medical platform. "Not much to clarify," he said. "Your princess needed medical attention, and the station had the equipment to provide it." Varys studied him carefully, clearly aware that the explanation was far simpler than the circumstances surrounding it. Lyra watched the exchange with quiet interest before speaking again. "Commander Varys," she said, her voice steady and clear. "If Sergeant Carter had not intervened when he did, I would not be sitting here now." The commander held her gaze for a moment before nodding slowly. "Then the Solarian Royal Guard owes the human marine a debt of gratitude." Daniel gave a small shrug. "Just doing the decent thing." Varys looked thoughtful for a moment before turning slightly toward the other guards in the corridor. "Ensure the station perimeter remains secure," he instructed calmly. The guards nodded and stepped back toward the hallway, leaving the chamber quieter once more. Varys then turned back toward Daniel and the princess. "Your Highness," he said, "the fleet will prepare a safe escort for your return to orbit whenever you are ready." Lyra listened to the report, but her eyes drifted once again toward the human soldier who had remained beside her through the quiet hours of recovery. "Commander," she said softly, Before we depart this world, there is something important that must be discussed. Commander Varys remained still after hearing the princess's words, the quiet weight of her statement settling across the room like the calm before an important decision. The medical chamber seemed even quieter now, filled only with the gentle hum of diagnostic equipment and the distant vibration of the royal fleet hovering above the desert sky. Sergeant Daniel Carter stood a few feet away from the medical platform, his posture relaxed but attentive as he waited for the princess to continue. Princess Lyra Vale rested one hand lightly against the edge of the platform, while the soft glow of the station lights reflected across her blue skin and silver hair. The strength in her voice had returned fully now, and when she spoke again her words carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Commander Varys," she said slowly, "during the last several hours I have had time to consider the circumstances that brought me to this station." Varys inclined his head respectfully. "Your Highness, we will investigate every detail once you are safely aboard the fleet." Lyra shook her head gently. "The investigation may not require as much time as you think." The commander looked slightly puzzled, but waited patiently for her explanation. Lyra's gaze moved briefly toward the observation window where the silver ships glimmered like distant moons against the darkening sky. "When my transport lost control during atmospheric descent," she said calmly, "I expected to face the consequences of an unfortunate accident." She paused for a moment before continuing. "Instead, I discovered something unexpected." Commander Varys followed her line of sight toward the human marine standing quietly near the center of the room. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, but said nothing. Lyra's eyes returned to the commander. "Sergeant Carter entered this medical chamber not as a conqueror or an enemy," she explained, "but as someone who saw a wounded patient and chose to help." Varys listened carefully, the disciplined calm of a seasoned officer evident in his expression. The nurse beside the console lowered her gaze toward the monitors, though it was clear she was listening to every word. Lyra continued speaking with the same steady clarity. "For many years our people have believed that humans approach the galaxy with only ambition and aggression," she said. "Yet the soldier standing here chose compassion even when our civilizations remain in conflict." Daniel gave a small, uneasy smile at that description. "I just followed basic medical training," he said quietly. Lyra looked toward him with a faint expression of amusement before turning back to the commander. "Perhaps," she said, "but sometimes the simplest choices reveal the most important truths." Commander Varys studied the human marine again with a thoughtful gaze. The silence that followed was not tense this time, but reflective, as if the room itself understood that something larger than a single rescue had just occurred. Finally Varys nodded slowly. "Your Highness," he said, "if the events unfolded as you describe, then Sergeant Carter's actions deserve recognition beyond simple gratitude." Daniel raised one eyebrow. "Recognition sounds like paperwork," he said lightly. Lyra allowed herself another faint smile. "Perhaps," she replied, "but it may also represent something else." Daniel looked at her curiously. "And what would that be?" Lyra's violet eyes met his with calm certainty. "An opportunity," she said softly, "for two worlds to begin asking whether they misunderstood each other from the very beginning." The quiet weight of Princess Lyra Vale's words lingered in the medical chamber long after she finished speaking, as though the idea itself had altered the air inside the station. Outside the observation window, the silver ships of the royal fleet continued to hover across the darkening sky, their distant engines creating a low, steady resonance that vibrated gently through the structure of the outpost. Sergeant Daniel Carter stood near the center of the room with his arms loosely folded, watching the princess with an expression that balanced curiosity and mild disbelief. Commander Varys remained beside the medical platform, his posture disciplined yet thoughtful as he considered the meaning behind her statement. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room came from the medical equipment, quietly confirming that the princess's condition continued to improve. Finally Varys spoke. "Your Highness," he said slowly, "our mission was to locate you and ensure your safe return to the fleet. Matters of diplomacy between civilizations are usually handled by ambassadors and councils." Lyra inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the practicality of his point. "That is true," she said calmly. "Yet diplomacy often begins long before ambassadors arrive." Her violet eyes moved briefly toward the human marine. Sometimes it begins with a single action that proves our assumptions were incomplete. Daniel shifted his weight and glanced toward the observation window again before replying. I should probably warn everyone that I am not exactly ambassador material. The nurse allowed a small quiet laugh while checking the diagnostic display. Vari studied Daniel for another moment before speaking again. Sergeant Carter, he said, your actions place the safety of another being above the hostilities between our peoples. That decision carries meaning beyond this station. Daniel gave a modest shrug. Honestly, Commander, it mostly felt like basic decency. Lyra watched him carefully. And yet, she said gently, decency is often the rarest choice during times of conflict. Daniel did not answer right away. He looked down at the polished metal floor for a moment before glancing back toward the princess. If we are being honest, he said slowly, most soldiers on either side probably wish someone would figure out how to end the misunderstandings that keep starting these fights. Varys considered that statement carefully. Outside the window, one of the larger royal vessels adjusted its position slightly in the sky, its silver hull reflecting the deep violet color of the evening atmosphere. The commander finally nodded. You may be correct, he said. Wars are often built from small misunderstandings that grow larger with time. Lyra leaned slightly forward on the medical platform, her strength continuing to return as the healing patterns faded gradually from her skin. Which is why this moment matters, she said quietly. My people arrived expecting to retrieve their princess from enemy territory. Instead, they found a human soldier who chose compassion over conflict. The nurse finished closing one of the medical panels and stepped back from the console, clearly satisfied with the princess's progress. Daniel exhaled slowly and looked toward the commander again. So what happens now? Varys met his gaze with calm certainty. Now, he said, the story of what happened inside this small medical station will travel much farther than any of the ships waiting above this world. Lyra's faint smile returned as she looked at the human marine once more. And when it does, she added softly, two civilizations may finally begin asking a question neither of them considered before. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. Which question is that? Lyra's voice remained calm and thoughtful as she answered. What if the first step toward peace was simply choosing to see each other as people instead of enemies? For several moments after the princess spoke, the room remained completely still, as if everyone present understood that something larger than a simple rescue had just taken shape inside the quiet walls of the medical station. Outside the observation window, the sky had grown darker, and the silver vessels of the royal fleet now glowed faintly against the deep violet horizon like distant lanterns suspended above the desert. Their engines continued their low, steady resonance, a sound so constant it had begun to feel like part of the planet itself. Sergeant Daniel Carter leaned lightly against the edge of the console again, studying the small room that had suddenly become the center of an event none of them had expected when the day began. Commander Varys stood beside the medical platform with a posture that remained formal but noticeably more relaxed than when he first entered the station. Princess Lyra Vale rested one hand along the smooth surface of the platform while the last traces of the healing patterns faded slowly from her blue skin. The nurse finished closing the final medical interface and stepped back with quiet satisfaction. Your Highness, she said softly, your recovery cycle is complete. You may leave the platform whenever you feel ready. Lyra took a slow breath and carefully shifted her position, testing her strength before placing one foot gently on the floor of the medical chamber. The motion was steady and controlled, and after a moment she rose to stand beside the platform. Commander Varys instinctively moved a step forward, prepared to assist, but the princess remained balanced without difficulty. Daniel watched the moment with a small nod of approval. Looks like you are officially back on your feet, he said. Lyra turned toward him, her silver hair catching the soft blue light of the room as she stood upright for the first time since arriving at the station. Yes, she replied calmly. Thanks to the unusual kindness of a human marine. Daniel lifted both hands slightly in a gesture of modest surrender. I still think the nurse deserves most of the credit. The nurse smiled faintly, but said nothing. Commander Varys glanced toward the observation window where one of the escort vessels had now descended closer to the ground, its landing lights illuminating a section of the desert just beyond the station entrance. Your Highness, he said respectfully. Your shuttle is ready whenever you wish to return to the fleet. Lyra followed his gaze for a moment before slowly turning back toward Daniel. The calm certainty in her expression had not changed. Sergeant Carter, she said gently, before I leave this world there is one final matter. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. That sounds serious. Lyra stepped closer to him, though she maintained the respectful distance expected between individuals from different worlds. Earlier you asked what happens now, she said. Now we ensure that what occurred here does not remain a forgotten moment inside a remote outpost. Daniel folded his arms again with mild curiosity. And how exactly do we do that? Lyra glanced briefly toward Commander Varys, who nodded in quiet understanding. The princess then returned her attention to the human marine. When my fleet returns to our capital system, she explained, I will present a full account of what happened here to my father and to the Solarian Council. Daniel tilted his head thoughtfully. Your people might be surprised to hear a good story about a human soldier. Lyra allowed herself a small smile. Perhaps, she said. But sometimes a single story is enough to make an entire civilization pause and reconsider what it believes. Outside the station, the desert wind shifted again, carrying soft waves of sand across the landing lights of the waiting shuttle. Lyra looked toward the doorway leading to the corridor and then back to Daniel once more. And when that story reaches your world as well, she said quietly, both sides may finally realize that the first step toward understanding began here, in a small medical station where an enemy chose to help instead of walk away. The desert night had fully settled over the outpost by the time Princess Lyra Vale stepped toward the open corridor leading to the landing pad. Through the observation window, the royal shuttle waited on the sand outside, its silver hull illuminated by soft landing lights that painted long shadows across the quiet red dunes. The distant fleet still hovered above like silent guardians, their faint glow scattered across the sky. Inside the medical station, the last medical instruments had gone quiet, their work complete. Sergeant Daniel Carter stood near the doorway watching the small escort team preparing to guide the princess outside. Commander Varys waited respectfully beside her, though it was clear he allowed the princess to choose the pace of this moment. Lyra paused at the threshold and turned back toward the room one last time. Her violet eyes found Daniel immediately. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. The station seemed to hold the silence carefully, as if it understood that this quiet exchange mattered more than the fleets outside or the politics between their worlds. Daniel finally gave a small half-smile. Looks like your ride is ready. Lyra nodded gently. Yes. She stepped closer to him again, the soft blue light of the room reflecting along her silver hair. Sergeant Carter, she said calmly, when my father hears what happened here, he will ask a simple question. Daniel tilted his head slightly. What kind of question? Lyra's expression held both warmth and quiet determination. He will ask why a human soldier helped an alien princess when the galaxy insists that our species should be enemies. Daniel thought about that for a moment before answering. You can tell him it was not complicated. Lyra waited. Daniel shrugged lightly. Someone needed help. The princess studied him as though committing the answer to memory. Then she nodded slowly. I will tell him exactly that. Commander Varys stepped forward gently. Your Highness, the shuttle is ready. Lyra turned toward the corridor, but paused again after only a step. She looked back at Daniel once more. Sergeant Carter. Yes, ma'am. When our civilizations speak again, she said softly, I hope they remember that the first step did not happen in a council chamber or a battlefield. Daniel crossed his arms loosely, curious. Where did it happen then? Lyra's faint smile returned as she gestured lightly toward the quiet medical room around them. It happened in a small station where one human chose kindness over suspicion. She turned and walked toward the corridor with Commander Varys and the escort guards following beside her. The soft echo of their footsteps faded gradually. As they moved toward the landing pad outside, Daniel remained where he was for a moment, listening as the distant hum of the shuttle engines slowly grew louder. Through the observation window, he watched the silver craft lift gently from the desert floor and rise toward the waiting fleet above. Soon the sky returned to its quiet constellation of distant lights. The outpost medical station fell silent again. Daniel exhaled slowly and glanced around the empty room before turning back toward the console. The galaxy outside had not changed yet, But somewhere far above that quiet desert world, a story had just begun its journey between two civilizations. And sometimes, Daniel thought, that was how history actually started.